Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Jason's Take On. Today, we'll be talking about how do you measure the impact of customer success. My name is Jason Whitehead, coming to you from sunny Washington, D.C. Very excited to be here today. And on our podcast, as we look at a variety of customer success issues and topics and exciting things. And I'm joined today by my co-host, Jason Noble, over in the UK. Say hello, Jason.
Good evening. Hello, Jason. It's not sunny here. It's in London. It's dark and cold right now, but hello, everybody.
All right. Good times. Thank you so much. And before we jump in, because this really is an interesting topic for us about how to measure the impact of customer success, because as you can have a great customer success and program and exciting things, but you've got to be able to prove it. So we're going to be talking about that today and how do you get there. But before we jump into that, we always like to start with a bold challenge question. So our challenge question for you this time is, what bold action can you take to make sure you are measuring the right stuff as it relates to customer success? So give that some thought and we'll come back to that at the end. So let's just go ahead and jump right in. Jason, why are we talking about this? Why is this so important?
I love the bold question because it's the right stuff. And you could argue that it's not just the right stuff for customer success, but it potentially is the right stuff for business. And for a lot of organizations. And I think this is really a very meaty topic. And I think it's something that we'll probably need to do another podcast or two on because we're going to scratch the surface. But it is so critical. And there are lots of challenges around how do you measure it. I've seen this many times in my career when you're asked to justify the ROI on it. And it takes time. It's not necessarily obvious quickly. And the results aren't obvious quickly. But I think one of the challenges we've got is it isn't 100% clear still for many organizations that what customer success really is, what it means for them, what it means for their customers, despite all the work that's been doing in the community, all the great changes, the announcements like we've seen with Gainsight this week. But without understanding what it really is or what it means to you or your customers, this makes it very difficult to prove success or failure. And I think equally, it's then hard to prove value to your customers, to your execs, to your board, but also to other departments. And I've seen multiple challenges throughout my career where part of your role is it's the selling of customer success internally. And I think ultimately what you're trying to do is you need to prove that you're driving value to the business through driving value to the customers. And there are lots of different ideas and metrics about how you measure success for this. I think what we need to do though is we need to be consistent. There need to be a list of industry best practice standard metrics out there, standard ways of measuring it that we can all use that are all really well understood. And I think that the key question that goes to what does success mean to us? How do we measure the impact of our success is how are we contributing to our company and our company goals and our customers' goals? And if we don't know how to measure it, this ultimately makes it very difficult to measure what the impact is we're having.
Yeah.
And I think let me push a question back to you, Jace. How do you, when we look at the different measures we should have, should we look at both kind of those objective ones where there's real data behind them and subjective ones? Does it make sense to have both of them? And what's the value of each of them and each different type?
Yeah, I think that's one that always comes up. And it's fun too when you're having a sales conversation around selling customer success or services and training too. People are always like, what's the ROI and how do you prove the value of this? And people are always looking for a reason to justify what they're doing and where they're going. So I think it's important to have both the objective and the subjective measures because different things will resonate with different people and people look for different things. But I think there's a lot of things to this, so jump in here too. But I think you really need to be clear on the commercial impact that you're doing because when people get talking about the sizable investment in customer success and staff and tools and processes, and in engaging customers differently, it's pretty significant and it can be very significant. So it has to prove that it can deliver a significant return. And there's always that dollar and cents component. And in fact, I've had numerous conversations with folks there. Their organizations had started customer success. They invested in a team, they invested in processes and training and tools and all the good stuff. And a couple of years later, they got rid of the whole department because they didn't see the value and they didn't understand the value. And I think so much of that comes to people weren't measuring it well or explaining it well. So I think that's really important to have that there. But I do also think too that you need to have some subjective measures too, because people, it's not just about the numbers when it comes to customer experience, and customers don't just renew on the numbers, they renew a lot on the perception. So you've got to think about what are the things that we can do in there to really go out there and say, are our customers satisfied? Are our customers perceiving value? Are they getting this value? And sometimes customers will tell you that yes, we are, or no, we're not, and here's why. But sometimes they won't. So I think you need to have a mixture of both in there. But why don't you jump in? What are your thoughts on
Yeah,
this?
I think I think you're right, and you do need a good mix of the two, and it's getting that balance. And you always can get pulled up on the more subjective ones because they potentially lack credibility. It relies on your judgment. Now, I don't think that's a bad thing because I think part of what the things we do in customer success is we try to understand our customers, and that takes a great deal of skill and experience. I think there's a good counter argument when someone says that subjective measures can lack credibility. I think you've also got to be careful when you do it because there's always going to be some sort of response bias,
Sure.
and that could be in how we're presenting, how we're seeing things. It could be how, our customers might always not be comfortable telling us directly when things go wrong, though you'd hope through the relationships that you build that trust, and that takes time. And we've spoken about this before, but once you've got the trust there, they should do that. And I think the other things you've just got to look at if you look at some of the inaccuracies that are in election polling data,
I was just going to say that.
there's a huge challenge around that. The numbers are vast. You've got human error that can come into it. And just because you have a measure and a structured process, it doesn't mean it has to be accurate, or it doesn't mean it is accurate. So you've got to go through a credibility, a due diligence process to make sure that these subjective measures can be backed up. And I think once you've done it, people accept it. So if you come up with a customer sentiment feeling, this is what the impact is on sentiment, this is how I'm measuring it, people understand. If you can justify it, people know where it's come from. And I think that's really important to look at.
Yeah. And I think related to that too is why are you collecting the data and how are you going to use
Yep,
it? So,
absolutely.
Earlier, how you collect data and use it to justify, like to a chief financial officer or a CEO, the impact of what you're doing may be very different than the way you would collect and use data around how to optimize and mature your customer success processes and operations and kind of things. So I think one of the things in here, in my mind, is a lot of the objective numbers can tell you the what and the how, what's going on, how are things changing, how much has it changed over time. But I think a lot of the subjective stuff gives you the why answers. Why do our customers perceive us this way? Why are they not renewing? Why are they coming to us over a competitor or leaving us for a competitor? And I think you really need both. So I think some of the more objective ones are great for the impact and for building support across your organization and even with some of your customers. But some of the more subjective ones, I think, are really great to help you optimize your operations and to really learn.
Absolutely.
And sorry, if I cut you off, do you have something else you want to?
No. I think that's cool. You've covered some really good stuff there. And I think that balance is important. I think it really is.
So let me throw one over to you here then. So with all this focus on the data and the numbers, how do we actually analyze data and convert it into action? Because I think that scenario where so many folks break down is like, all right, I've got all kinds of numbers. So what?
Yeah. And that is, I think we're still learning. The whole idea of data analytics and data science is still relatively new, like customer success. And I think there are still relatively limited number of experts out there, but it's a specialism. And it isn't just about gathering the data and the evidence. That's one part of it. It's what does that actually tell me? What's the message behind it? And more importantly, what's the questions I need to be asking? And that I think we often do the wrong way around. We look at the data and try to find something from the data. Well, you can do that, but start asking the business questions and use the data to answer those questions. And I think that the key issue is how do you put the data into action? Clear on what you think needs to happen. And I think you've also got to have that influence across your organization to get others to take actions, bold actions even, to have impacts based on that data. So the data can give you some insights and there's actions that can come from those insights. And those are three distinct steps. And I think you also see lots of people looking to the industry for what are industry benchmarks, what are standards. And this can give you some insight and some guidance, but how relevant is it to your industry? How relevant is it to your customers, to your business? NPS, I think, is a great one. There's a lot of data to come up with what your net promoter score is. But one of the problems and pitfalls I've seen people do multiple times is compare yourself against industry standard organizations that aren't your organization. They're not the same history as you, the same legacy or the same challenges that you've got. And that can be a big problem. So you've got to look at the right way of doing it and make sure that you're not just doing it for vanity's sake, that you're doing it because it's relevant to you. You know, what are your unique needs, your unique processes, the unique timelines that affect your business, your customers, and your industry that would impact that ability to use those standards.
Yeah.
I think the other thing is it's also, and this is NPS is a great measure of this. It's how do you measure the impact over time? It's not at any one point in time, it's the trend behind the impact. And so much of what we're doing in customer success is about maturing our organization, understanding what's working, what's not. And you've really got to push for that. And I know from the podcast that we did with Laura Culbertson from Loop VOC, they've got an awesome tool there that really drives their voice of the customer programs and processes. But it also allows you to take it back to track actions and interventions so you can measure the impact on the actions with the customers. And that's really key. Any thoughts on that you could add?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Lauren. She was such a great guest, and I encourage everyone to go listen to that episode. And it was so impressive when I saw the demo of their tool and what they're doing, that being able to not just have data, but have actions and being able to log the input is key. And I got thinking about too, when you were talking about, what's the purpose with your info and to be able to create context is, I've seen where some organizations go and people are like, let me look at the data to prove or disprove a hypothesis. Let me build up to a conclusion and see where I want to go. And then I've seen other political organizations go the other way, where here's the answer I want and where I want everyone to get to. Let me find some data and things to justify it. And how do I get people to fit in that? And so I think you really have to be careful there. And I remember back in high school when I had a statistics class, we were required to read the book, How to Lie with Statistics. And I think it was written in the 50s or 60s or something like that. But I think the lessons in that were just as relevant today as they were back then. And I encourage people to go read the book. And what I really liked in there is it taught you how to say data can be either manipulated if you assume malintent, or just misconstrued if you assume ignorance or not looking at the context and the big questions. And really, the more that you can understand how data tells a different story depending how it's presented, how it's analyzed, and how it goes is so important. And I think everyone should have some skills and familiarity with that so they can ask the right questions and be critical of the data so that they don't make faulty judgments around it. So that was one thing that really came out to me that I thought was really important for people to understand that. And I also like what you said too about really coming back to so what are the actions we're going to take? And it got me thinking about when I was doing my master's in organization development. And it was a very interesting program about how do you grow organizations and do different types of interventions and neat things. And one of the things that we were required to do in most every class there was keeping a journal. And the journaling technique that we had to use was a 3-step process. And I actually recommend people do it today. And it was take an incident that happened in your work life. And it was work life or with the customer or internal in your office, whatever it may be. And step 1 is just write down very shortly, it can be bullet points or a couple things, and describe what happened and provide detail and sort of the data to make the situation clear and really understand what it was. And then in step 2, going through and really identify what did I learn from this situation? Because the learning doesn't happen in the middle of in an action or in a situation. It happens after the fact when you review it. So what did I learn from this? What did the data tell me? What did I piece together from this experience all the way through? And then going into step 3, coming and saying, now what will I do differently as a result of this in the future? How do I apply what I've learned going forward? And it's such a simple process, but really important. And I've used this on my own in a journaling technique and found the ahas very helpful, but I've really had some great results working with clients and customers, doing lesson learned reviews and getting people through this so that everyone could recognize new things. And I think that's a big piece of this is just collecting data and just focusing on the numbers is only half the story. You've got to close the loop and analyze it, understand it, get insight, and then take action from it. So
I think that closing the loop is so critical. And it's how do you do something with it? And that quite often is the hard bit to do. We've got the data, we've got some numbers, but how do you take actions from it and then look at the measurements of those actions? And I think the next question I was going to ask, and I think let's think about this between us. What are some of the measurements that we've used and we'd recommend? And the one, I mentioned it before, but I do like it. I'm a big fan of it, is Net Promoter Score. But for me, I don't like transactional NPS. I like it more at a relationship level. So do it periodically across all your customer base. ask them the same question. Would you recommend me? And I'm in two minds whether it's to a friend or colleague, because in some instances, my friends would have no interest whatsoever in using my services. But you can look at it to a business partner or colleague or something like that, but it's the same essence behind it. But NPS as a number on its own doesn't tell you much in isolation. Right. Yes, you can look at the trend for you and you can see how it's varying, and that gives you a picture of what direction things are going in. But the real key is understanding the why behind the question. And that requires, exactly like you said, that's where the close the loop comes in. Mm-hmm. And whenever I've done this in multiple organizations, that's where the big effort is. It takes a lot of work and effort to go back to your customers and why did you leave this score? What did you mean by this? And have those follow-up conversations. But that's where the real value comes from. And what you can then do with that as well is then do sentiment analysis based on their contextual answers. And I think that gives you a lot more insight, and it gives you some really critical feedback for product as well. Someone wouldn't recommend you. Why not? They might have had issues with support. They might have had issues with the renewal, the price or product, but it feeds into that. So I'm a huge fan of NPS. It's something that I'm currently in the process of rolling out our program now as part of our Voice of the Customer program, but it requires time and effort to do it. Another kind of big one that I like is net retention rate. Mm-hmm. And for me, that is really important because it brings in all of your upsell, your cross-sell, but it also brings in the churn. So it gives you a really nice dynamic of how things are really going as a business, just in terms of your growth based on what's happening with your customers. It's real. It's not just about growth. It's about how they're changing and how the dynamics are changing with them. So I really big fan of those two, and two that I'd really encourage people to use. Any that you've used, Jason, that you'd think would recommend?
Well, I've got a few that I enjoy and recommended. I know a lot of people like NPS, and I'm not quite the fan of it that you are. I think a lot of people have misconstrued it and taken it to be too much of the gold standard if we hit the number here or there, as opposed to what's really going on. And one of the bold questions or bold actions I've suggested to customers and clients and things is NPS is, would you recommend me to another customer? That's only half of what people are wanting. Yep. Maybe this is a British American thing too, where I'm like, just ask the question you want the answer to and be a little bit more direct. Whereas I think the polite folk go with the, would you recommend me? And the question that I say is, tell your customers right up front, like when you onboard them during the sales process, and just say, look, at the end of every single interaction, I'm going to ask you a very direct question. It's going to be awkward at first, but you'll get so used to it that you'll be comfortable, but it's going to help us have clear communication. And here's the question. At the end of every interaction, just simply say, over the entire course of your relationship with our company, not just using our product, but with our company, have you gotten enough value from us that if you had to renew today, would you? And it's a pretty yes or no question, because ultimately a renewal decision is a yes or no decision. So ask them that. And you might have a tense meeting. You might have to give bad news to the customer. You might have to say that we just can't deliver X, Y, and Z. But wouldn't you rather know if they're going to renew or not, or be able to say to them, but here's the other ways we're creating so much value for you. Yep. Is this enough for you? And ask that question.
I love this question. I don't think enough people ask this.
No.
You and I have talked about it before, but it really, it's a very honest question as well, because we want them to renew.
Absolutely.
No, normally, there are some instances when we don't, but we want them to renew. And I think it really brings it home.
Mm-hmm. I think so. And I think if they say yes, then you've got an opportunity to highlight all the value that you've gotten, and it makes that inevitable renewal easier. And if you get a no, especially if it's long before your contract is going to renew, you've got enough time to fix this, and you've got enough time to probe and say, well, let's talk about that and how we get to where you are, because obviously we want you to renew. And with the renewal thing, it does crack me up how I work with so many CS teams, and so many people are afraid just to ask for the renewal. And it will come as no surprise to your customer that you want them to renew and buy more. In fact, they know this before they even come to you to get a quote. So it's the name of the game. So just be upfront about it and just relax. It's just a conversation here. But anyway, I think that what I like to call more of a renewal intent question as opposed to an NPS question is a much more direct and effective way. But I've yet to see people be bold enough to do that. And I encourage all of our listeners to go and be bold and take this on. I'm also excited. I don't remember all the specifics, so jump in. But Adam Joseph, who's with Gainsight now and is going to be a guest coming up very soon on this. I was at a conference where he presented. I think you were there too. And he presented his concept of the watermelon customer.
Yep.
And I love that one. And the highlights that I recall were where they may have all the right numbers and metrics and they appear green in every dashboard and thing that you have, but they're really red on the inside. And they actually are planning to churn.
I think I remember that conference because I think it was Adam and Matt presenting, and it's a very clever concept, isn't it? So it's knowing that the metrics might not tell you everything. You've got to understand what really is going on by the customer, and that takes a lot more probing. And I think you're going to see it could be different depending on who the customers are. Are they high touch, low touch, wherever they fit? It could be very different there. And I think it brings me on to another point, that another good one that we need to measure, obviously, is monthly recurring revenue or annual recurring revenue, but try and do it by cohort. You know, when did these customers come on board? Where do they fit in our life cycle? And I think that can really add a lot of value, particularly for your low touch customers. And you can start looking to track activities, processes, and see what the impact is on satisfaction, retention, expansions. And you can even start doing some kind of your typical A/B analysis to see what's working, what isn't working, and run through it like that. And I think it's really important to do that. And I love, there's so many different metrics here. I mean, we could go on forever, really. I couldn't be talking about these, but there's some really key ones. And I think we're talking through really some good ones here. Any others you can think of?
I think there are quite a few. And I was going to mention an article that I recently wrote around equivalent metrics, and that won an award from SaaS Brief for this idea. And
nice plug there. Well done. Make sure you read it, everyone. Make sure you read it.
Yeah, link in the description below. Seriously, go and
check
it out. I think part of the idea here is coming up with metrics that are clear and meaningful to people, but also have scientific measurement. In calculating, it's harder to interpret and understand. And you can have both action equivalent metrics and feel good ones. So like, here's a number and here's where it goes. And one of the examples that I've seen folks do is you look on the back of a candy bar or a can of soda or anything like that, and it really just says, oh, this is how many calories you are included here. And really the idea is, by having the calorie count there, supposedly you will make a healthier choice decision. You'll understand, like, what's the equivalent amount of exercise I need to do? I got to run for an hour, I need to swim for an hour, I need to do what have you, that you can make an informed decision about, do I want to have this or a healthier option? And instead, they've actually tested where they printed just those equivalencies on the candy bar itself. So you do need to run for an hour for having this one little candy bar, or you need to go and swim for this. And by putting it there in that black and white of this is what it means, and now you can make an informed choice easier, I think that made it so much easier for people to do something with the actions and with the metrics and to take those actions, which we said are so key. So I would challenge customer success folks to think through, what are equivalent metrics that don't just tell you the numbers or the story of what is, but can guide you to what does this mean in terms of either actions you need to take, or the other side is what I call in the article feel-good metrics, which are, this is maybe not a scientific impact that we can have, but it can show you something meaningful that's important to us. And a lot of renewals decisions are based on subjectivity and perception, and is this important? But I think there's a lot of value there. But I won't go into any more detail on that, because I think we can really just check out the article, and maybe we'll do a follow-on podcast at some point around.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good thing to do. And I think there's a lot more to be said about these. And I think it does need that kind of really concise article like the one you've written. It really helps bring it home.
Yeah. So let me throw over to you then. What sort of mistakes do you see people making when it comes to measurement and metrics and all this good stuff?
This is a very good question. I think the answer is there are a lot. I've made a number of them. I'm sure you have, Jason, as well.
Never.
I think, I'll take it back then. Clearly, I'm not either. I think one of the things you can do is not measure enough and trying to pin everything down to one measurement. And like you say, I'm a fan of NPS, but people can rely on it too much.
Yeah.
So you've got to look at different metrics to bring in all sorts of different elements that come into it. You've got to look at the commercial side, which is where the retention rate metrics really help. You've got to look at things like the relationships, which where NPS can help. There are a number of other ones that you can bring in there. So I think you've got to look at the right metrics for your organization and for your customer. I think equally, the flip side is, and I think you said this when we spoke the other day, is you can have too many metrics. So you're almost, you don't know what you're looking for. And when you've got too many, you don't know what anything really means or how to take confidently the bold actions from it. And I think that's really key. I think was there not an instance where you'd seen a customer that had too many metrics there, Jason?
Oh yeah, too many metrics. They didn't know what was going on. They had to strip down so much because people just didn't know how to interpret the data and what to do with it. And in fact, I've had customers recently where they were asking me to help interpret what's going on and give them some guidance. And they showed me these convoluted spreadsheets of different things that I've seen a lot of what's in there in different industries. They had to sit with me for an hour to walk me through what all this stuff meant. And I'm like, I think you've over engineered this to the point that it's not helpful and it's time wasters. So that's a challenge. I'm also a member of a study that I read back when I was studying information systems, where there was a company, I think it was Frito-Lay, but it was so many moons ago that I can't be sure about that, where they were going through and trying to figure out how do we make reporting and data available to our frontline managers and our middle managers, where in the past, only a small number of executives really had the data, and they had all been there a long time to really understand it and built up their capabilities to do something with it. And they were like, oh, we'll give everyone access and decision-making will improve and operations will improve. And nothing of the sort happened.
Yep.
They went and did further research and they started interviewing the managers. They're like, you've given us this binder of information that we get all the time. We don't know what to look for. And we don't know if something's good or bad. So we spend time poring over this and okay, I guess that's important. But they didn't have that insight as to what was meaningful. And they didn't have the insight or the empowerment to take action with it. So I think many organizations still make that same mistake of don't assume that people will understand how to use the data, how to interpret the data or how to use it. So I think that's a big one.
I think that's really key. And I think the other really big thing is don't forget about data quality. You know,
So
a lot of organizations still have low quality, unreliable data, and often it's not good enough to make decisions on.
Mhm.
Now, that's not bad. You need to start somewhere, but I think you've got to look at data as more of a strategic asset. There's often said that data is the new oil. It has a massive amount of value, but you can give it more value by spending more time and effort on it and start asking the business questions and look at where your data is coming from. There's whole industries around data. And I think you've got to take active measures that really allow you to create and maintain high quality data. And if you don't do that, I think there's a risk of you setting yourself up for failure, thinking you've got the right processes here to come up with how we're going to measure the impact, but without the data there to do it, you've not got it there.
yeah,
And I think it's, you know, a great kind of, would you rather have a clock that doesn't work at all or one that loses a minute of time every day? It's a very, does it work or doesn't it work? What do you want and what's the quality of it?
I love that clock example too, because I remember someone saying that their answer was that a clock that's broken because it would be right at least twice a day.
Yep.
Someone actually did the math of if it loses 1 minute a day, it'd be like right once every 100 million years or something.
Absolutely.
I can't remember what the number was. But I agree 100% with the data quality piece, because I've also seen where so many organizations, they get political and they get into debating the merits of the data and the metrics themselves as a political tool around having to deal with a change in an insight that they could have that might paint some people or departments in a bad light.
Yeah.
And I think when you start going down the road of questioning the metrics and the quality of the data, you're in serious trouble. So you've got to figure out how to get ahead of that and get consensus around what those are.
Absolutely. And I think, let me brings me to mind one more question. I'm going to push this one back to you, Jason. What are the measurements then that we can use to measure our customers' success? That's the key thing. It's not just about the impact on our business, but how do we know we're delivering success for our customers?
Right. Because at the end of the day, if we're not doing that, they're not going to be renewing.
Absolutely.
That's so important. I think one of the ones that I think you came up with this one too was number of outcomes achieved versus number of outcomes expected. Because I think so much of the customer renewal decision is also about the delta between expectations and outcomes in reality, and finding a way to calibrate that and confidently measure it and have discussions with your customers is really key. So I think that's pretty important right there. And one of the things that I was, excuse me, we were talking about recently is with our new success chain program that I'm launching with Sue Navitt-Moore, my co-host, and Kelly Lucas, really looking at saying,
plug there, nothing wrong with that.
Shameless plug, they're going to keep coming. But it's so important too is that you have mutual success metrics and what is success for this customer and what is success for us, because in the short term, customer success always has to come first, because as a supplier, your success will only come after that. And they're not going to renew if they don't get the outcomes that they want. They're not going to expand, or they'll dramatically cut down their licenses. And in turn, your revenues will suffer and fall, and you won't be able to continue to have the resources to invest in the product and the services that your customer need. That eventually it's either going to be a growth spiral for both of you or a death spiral for you, and your customer is going to waste time and money moving on to another supplier. So having that mutual mindset and mutual measurements, I think, are really key in there. What other things would you throw out there?
I love that, and I've said to you before, this kind of mutual success thing I think is so important, and it gives you a very different mindset. It's all about this open relationship with our customers. This isn't just about their success, it's about our success. And I think the other thing that you are seeing now is this kind of shift from the idea of key performance indicators, so your KPI metrics, to managing OKRs. And I myself have had some challenges shifting these models, but it's to look more at kind of OKRs, or objectives and key results. And you tend to have fewer of them.
Mm-hmm.
They often are more short term and more reliant on a lot more self-reporting. You know, what is our quarterly objective? How will we know when we're achieving it? They can be very direct and a lot more powerful. And it's good to see a lot of businesses going through that and working with our customers on that. Ask your customer, what are your quarterly objectives? What do you hope to achieve in the next 12 months? These are questions that I'm asking my customers. And how do you then, they give you those results. Well, how can we help you achieve that? And that's so important. And I think you get a lot of partners and vendors shy away from asking those questions, but they're really key ones to ask, and they should be there, part of your EBRs, your QBRs, or as I like to call them, your customer value reviews. Make sure you're asking, what are your plans? What are you doing? As we go into the end of this year and start planning for next year, what are you hoping to achieve next year? Because that should be part of your success plan. And then knowing what you can do to achieve it and holding yourself and the customers to account against it. Those for me are the really key ones.
Yeah. And it reminds me, my business partner, Sue Nabbit-Moore, she's always advocating around what she calls AM/PM metrics. And the AM one are adoption metrics or activity metrics. And I often refer to them as trajectory metrics. And then PM are performance metrics. Yeah. And when onboarding new customers, and especially with customer success, there's a long lead time before you see those performance improvements consistently as you go through. And if your customer is losing faith in what they're doing, you've got to have something to point to that says we're on the right track, the performance metrics are coming. So we recommend defining them right up front. What are the short-term activity metrics or adoption metrics, or what I call trajectory ones, that will give you confidence we're on the right track? And let's track those in the short term while we're gathering the data and information we need to say, yes, we're going to get the performance outcomes that we want. And then when you have enough data, then switching over the focus towards what are the performance metrics? Are we doing what we need to do? And then obviously circling back again, what new activities do we need to be doing to improve on those year after year? So I think getting customers in that mindset is really key too. Great.
I think, guys, that I think is it for our questions. Do you want to close us off, Jace?
Yeah. So thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. Hope this has been helpful for you. Please send us your comments and feedback. We're on LinkedIn. We'd love to have you follow us on the Jasons there. And also the jasonstakeon.com. We've got a lot of exciting guests coming up, and we're always looking for your insights and feedback around questions that you'd like us to answer or guests you would recommend. So thanks so much for joining us. And as always, we want to just end with recapping our bold challenge question. And for this month, it's what bold action can you take to make sure you're measuring the right stuff? So let us know your thoughts. We'd love to hear what you're measuring and how it's working for you. All right, from Washington, D.C., I'm Jason Whitehead. Thank you so much.
And thank you from London, and Jason Noble. Have a great weekend, everyone.
All right, take care.
Bye.